The man, Arthur Pindle, was not a man given to great passions or wild flights of fancy. He was a cataloger of minutiae, a keeper of quiet halls, and his life was the dust that settled on forgotten things. His domain was the municipal archive, a building of gray stone and grimy windows that stood as a solemn promise of boredom. His task that day was as dry as the air: to sort through a recent donation of papers from the defunct Albion Club, a society for gentlemen with more curiosity than sense. The box, a crate of splintered wood and faded stencil, held no initial promise. It was full of ledgers detailing wine purchases, minutes from meetings debating the migratory patterns of the common sparrow, and brittle invitations to long-concluded galas. Arthur worked with a methodical rhythm, his hands pale and precise, moving from pile to pile. He was a man who appreciated the finality of a completed task, the neat tick on a checklist. It was deep within this sedimentary layer of tedium that his fingers brushed against something that was not paper. It was cool, smooth, and hard. He carefully shifted a stack of invoices tied with a disintegrating ribbon and revealed a small, flat box of dark, polished wood. It was unadorned, its only feature a delicate brass clasp that was tarnished to a deep umber. There was no label, no marking of any kind. Intrigued, a rare sensation for Arthur, he lifted the box. It was heavier than it looked. He placed it on his cleared desk, the wood stark against the green blotter. The clasp opened with a soft, definitive click. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded velvet the color of a winter twilight, was a key. It was an object of singular beauty and oddity. It was not large, perhaps the length of his thumb, and forged from a metal that seemed to drink the light, a deep, smoky iron. Its bow was not a simple loop but an intricate swirling knot that suggested no beginning and no end. The bit was a complex series of teeth and valleys, a jagged, nonsensical silhouette. It felt ancient, but not in a way Arthur could place. It was not Roman or medieval. It was something else, something other. It felt less like a made thing and more like a grown thing, a metallic seed from a tree that no longer stood in any known forest. There was no tag, no note, no indication of what lock this beautiful, bizarre object might ever hope to open. Arthur turned it over in his palm. It was cold, and the coldness seemed to seep into his skin, a subtle chill that traveled up his wrist. He felt a profound and unsettling connection to it, as if it had been waiting for him, specifically in that box of forgotten trivia. He spent the rest of the day distracted. The ledgers blurred into a smear of numbers, the minutes into a drone of voices. His mind kept returning to the key, its weight in his pocket, its cold press against his thigh. He left work early, a nearly unprecedented act, the key a secret lodestone in his coat. That night in his small, ordered flat, the key sat on his kitchen table. He ate his simple meal of soup and bread, his eyes fixed upon it. The silence of his home, usually a comfort, felt different. It was a listening silence. He went to bed, but sleep was slow to come. When it did, his dreams were not of keys or locks, but of vast, empty spaces and a profound, resonant hum that vibrated in his bones. The next day, Arthur was a man possessed. The methodical archivist was gone, replaced by a seeker. He began a new private catalog. He took notes. He measured the key, sketched its form, documented its every peculiarity. He visited locksmiths, the old kind with shops that smelled of oil and metal filings. The first, a man with spectacles on the end of his nose, merely shook his head. Never seen the like. That is not for a door or a chest, not a practical thing. The second, a younger man with tattooed arms, was fascinated. He took pictures, asked to make a wax impression, which Arthur, with a sudden, fierce protectiveness, refused. The key began to change his life in small, insidious ways. He started to notice locks, not just the normal ones on doors and diaries, but the strange ones. The old, disused gate at the back of the city park, the brass panel on the side of the public clock tower, the heavy, iron-banded door in the basement of his own archive, a door he had passed 1,000 times without a second thought. He found himself trying the key in these places, always in moments of solitude, his heart a frantic drum in his chest. The key never fit. It would not even enter the keyways. This should have been a relief, but it only deepened the mystery, sharpening his obsession. He began to research the Albion Club with a new focus. He pored over the remaining documents, no longer seeing lists of port and sherry, but searching for hints of the esoteric, the strange. He found traces, a bill for optical lenses of unique specification from a glassblower who had gone out of business 50 years prior, a cryptic note in a margin: the theory of resonant apertures remains unproven. And a name mentioned only once in a sheaf of personal correspondence: Dr. Alastair Finch. Tracking down Dr. Finch was the work of another week. The man had left no great public legacy. He was a footnote, a gentleman scientist of private means. Arthur finally found a reference in a digitized university alumni newsletter. Dr. Alastair Finch had bequeathed his personal papers to the geology department of a small, nearly forgotten university on the other side of the city. It was a long shot, a thread thinner than gossamer, but it was the only one he had. The university was a collection of Gothic Revival buildings huddled around a damp quadrangle. The geology department was in the oldest wing, a place that smelled of wet stone and old books. The archivist there, a woman named Elise, was young and briskly efficient. When Arthur explained his interest in Dr. Finch, her eyes lit with recognition. Finch, oh yes, the harmonic geologist. No one ever asks for him. His boxes are in the sub-basement. Follow me. She led him down a flight of stairs, then another into a cavernous space with a low, vaulted ceiling. It was cold and the air was still and heavy. The Finch collection consisted of 3 large crates. Elise left him with a warning to reseal everything properly. For hours Arthur worked. It was more of the same: geological surveys, notes on rock strata, sketches of crystals. His hope began to wane. Then at the very bottom of the 3rd crate, under a stack of topographical maps, he found a journal. It was bound in cheap leather, its pages filled with a tight, frantic script, and there on a page near the end was a drawing, a perfect, meticulous sketch of the key. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He began to read, his heart pounding. April 17th. The theory is sound. The world is not a solid thing. It is a thing of layers, of vibrations. Certain points possess a thinness, a resonance. The key is not a key for a lock of iron, but for a lock in the world itself, a lock of silence. May 2nd, I have found it, the place. The calculations were complex, but the resonance is unmistakable. It is a place where the hum of existence is quiet, where the fabric is worn thin. It is in the old subway tunnel, the one they sealed off after the 23 collapse. The silence there is not an absence of sound, it is a substance. May 15th, I went back, I brought the key. The feeling is overwhelming, a pressure in the ears, a stillness that feels alive. I held the key, I felt it grow warm. I know with a certainty that chills me that it would turn, but I did not have the courage. What is on the other side of silence? Is it a deeper silence, or is it a sound for which we have no name? Arthur stopped reading. The old subway tunnel, the 23 collapse, he knew of it. It was a local legend, a section of the network that had been catastrophically sealed after a geological survey went wrong. It was now a forgotten ghost in the city's underbelly. He copied the journal's location in his notes. He felt a cold terror, but beneath it a thrilling, undeniable pull. This was the answer, this was the lock. The entrance was not easy to find. It was behind a chain-link fence in a neglected service yard. A heavy, rusted metal door set into a concrete abutment, almost invisible behind overgrown weeds. The lock on the door was a massive, rusted thing, clearly modern, clearly not the lock of silence. This was just the way in. Arthur, using a set of bolt cutters he had brought, severed the thick padlock. The door swung inward with a groan of protest, revealing a darkness that was absolute and cool. He switched on his powerful torch. The beam cut a swath through the black, illuminating a descending tunnel. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and age. He walked for what felt like a mile, the world above fading into a distant memory. The tunnel was a graveyard of forgotten projects, with old cables snaking along the walls and discarded tools rusting into the ground. Then he saw it. It was not a door. It was a place where the tunnel simply ended in a wall of rough-hewn rock, but it was not a natural formation. The rock was smooth in the center, and set into it, flush with the surface, was a keyhole. The keyhole was not metal, it seemed to be made of the same rock, but it was darker, a void so deep his torchlight could not penetrate it. And the shape, it was the exact negative image of the key's bit. This was the lock of silence. Arthur approached it. The air was different here, thicker. The hum of the city, the distant rumble of trains he had felt through the soles of his feet was gone. It was not just quiet, it was a vacuum of sound. He felt the pressure Dr. Finch had described, a weight on his eardrums. He took the key from his pocket. It was no longer cold. It was warm, almost hot, and it seemed to vibrate with a low, subaudible thrum. This was the moment of choice. He could turn back. He could return to his archives, to his ordered life, and this would become a strange story he would tell himself in his old age, or he could turn the key. His hand trembled as he raised it. He pushed the key towards the dark keyhole. It met no resistance. The complex teeth slid into the complex void as if they were molten metal meeting its mold. It was a perfect fit. He felt a click, not a sound, but a vibration that traveled up the key through his arm and into his core. He took a deep breath and turned the key. It moved smoothly, a quarter turn to the right. The world did not explode. There was no flash of light. Instead, the wall in front of him ceased to be a wall. It became a surface like still, black water. It reflected nothing. It was a portal of pure, silent potential. Arthur Pindle, the man of lists and dust, took a step forward, then another. He did not look back. He walked into the silence. On the other side, there was no tunnel, no city, no world as he knew it. There was only a vast open plain under a sky that was neither day nor night, but a perpetual soft twilight. The ground was covered in a fine gray sand, and in the distance were structures that his mind could not properly parse. They were angles that defied perspective, shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves. The silence was immense, a physical presence. It was not empty, though, it was full. It was the silence of things waiting to be, the quiet before the first word of a story, the hush at the beginning of time. He stood there, a small, fragile figure in his worn coat, and he understood. This was not an end. It was an archive of a different kind. It was the place where all the lost things, the forgotten ideas, the silent thoughts, and the unmade choices resided. He was not afraid. He felt a peace deeper than any he had ever known. He had spent his life cataloging the past. Here, he realized, he could explore the library of everything that never was. He began to walk forward into the soft, gray light, the key now warm and still in his hand, no longer a question but an answer. And for the first time, Arthur Pindle had no checklist, no ledger to update, no task to complete. He was simply and completely present in the endless, silent hum of what might be. The door, or the non-door, had closed behind him, leaving no trace in the tunnel but the memory of a man who had finally found the one thing worth seeking, a mystery that did not need to be solved. The gray sand made no sound under his feet. It did not crunch or shift, it simply accepted his weight, leaving perfect, fleeting impressions that vanished a moment after he lifted his soul. This was his first true understanding of the place. Nothing here was permanent. It was a realm of ephemera. He walked for a time that had no measure. The strange structures in the distance did not grow closer, nor did they recede. They hung on the horizon, impossible and constant, like fixed ideas in a floating mind. The air was still, yet it felt as if it were in constant, gentle motion against his skin, a silent river flowing from no source to no destination. He felt no thirst, no hunger, only a profound and deepening calm. He came to a stop, though he was not tired. He looked down at his hands, then at his coat. They seemed solid, real, an anchor in this sea of potential. He reached into his pocket and drew out the key. It glowed with a soft internal luminescence, a muted silver light that pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm like a sleeping heart. It was no longer warm, but held a temperature identical to his own skin, as if it had become a part of him. A thought clear and simple formed in his mind. What is this? As if in answer, the gray sand a few feet in front of him stirred. It did not blow in the wind, for there was none. Instead, it coalesced, rising in a fine, silent plume, spinning and weaving itself into a form. In moments, a shape stood before him. It was a chair, but it was not a chair of wood or metal. It was a chair of pure concept, its lines suggesting function and rest, yet it was transparent, a sculpture made of solidified air and memory. He reached out a hand. His fingers passed through it. It offered no resistance, but he felt a coolness, the ghost of a sensation. This, he understood, was a thing that had almost been. A design sketched on a napkin by a brilliant mind, then lost when the napkin was thrown away. A chair that never knew the weight of a person. He walked on. More shapes began to rise from the sand around him, responding to his presence, to his curiosity. A clock with no hands, its face a beautiful, swirling nebula. A musical instrument with strings of light, waiting for a touch that would never come. A book, its pages blank, yet he knew it contained a story of immense beauty that had died with the author before a single word was written. This was the archive of the unmade, the museum of almost. He felt a wave of sorrow, not for himself, but for these beautiful, phantom things. They had so nearly been real. They had hovered on the very brink of existence, only to be pulled back into this silent limbo. His archivist's soul ached for them. He wanted to catalog them, to give them some form of recognition, to save them from total oblivion. As this desire filled him, something new happened. The key in his hand pulsed brighter. The gray sand at his feet began to shift again, but this time it did not form an object. It formed a path. A faint, shimmering trail of slightly lighter gray stretched out before him, leading away from the impossible structures and towards a different part of the plain. He followed it without hesitation. The path led him to a vast, shallow depression in the landscape, and here the sand was not forming fleeting shapes, it was holding them. The basin was filled with ghosts, not the ghosts of people, but the ghosts of events. He saw a shimmering tableau of a peace treaty that was never signed, the delegates forever frozen in a moment of near agreement. He saw a battlefield where a truce had been almost called, the soldiers standing with confused expressions, their weapons half lowered. He saw a couple on a park bench, their hands an inch from touching, a single unspoken word hovering between them for all eternity. These were the pivotal moments, the branches on the tree of time that were never grown. The silence here was different. It was a silence of profound regret, not empty but heavy with the weight of what could have been. Arthur stood at the edge of this basin of lost chances and he wept. The tears were silent, absorbed by the immense quiet of the place. He wept for the saved lives, the mended hearts, the averted disasters that had come so close to being. He had spent his life tending to the past, but this was a different kind of history. This was the history of the future that never arrived. A new thought came to him, born from his tears. Is there a place for the forgotten? Not the almost was, but the once was. The key pulsed once, a strong, definitive beat. The path at his feet changed direction, leading him out of the basin of regret and towards a low, rolling hill. As he climbed it, the quality of the sand changed. It became grittier, more substantial, and held color, faint whispers of sepia, hints of faded blue, echoes of gold. At the crest of the hill, he stopped and caught his breath. The view that opened before him was both heartbreaking and beautiful. It was a vast, rolling plain of memories. He saw children's laughter, visible as tiny golden bells that floated for a moment before dissolving into dust. He saw old songs, their melodies written in swirling patterns of faded ink on the air. He saw faces, millions of them, each one the face of someone whose name had been spoken for the last time. They were not sad. They simply were, existing in a state of gentle dissolution, slowly returning their essence to the quiet of this place. This was the final archive, not of records and papers, but of lived experience. This was where moments went to rest when no one was left to remember them. His work in the municipal archive was a feeble, desperate echo of this. He had been trying to stem this inevitable tide, to fight against this final, gentle silence. He saw now the vanity of it and its profound beauty. He sat down on the hill overlooking the plain of forgotten things. He felt the key grow heavy in his hand. He looked at it, this beautiful, complex object that had been a question for so long. Now he understood its answer. It was not a key to a treasure or a prison. It was a key to understanding. It was a permit that allowed one to visit the hinterlands of reality, to see the scaffolding behind the stage. He knew, with a certainty that filled him with peace, that he could not stay. He was a thing of sound and consequence. His presence here was a note of dissonance in this great, silent symphony. He had seen what he needed to see. He had found the ultimate catalog, and in doing so, he had been freed from the need to catalog anything ever again. He stood up, he held the key in his palm and focused all his will, all his gratitude into a single, silent thought. I am ready to return. The key flared, brighter than ever before, a silent star in his hand. The world of gray sand and twilight began to dissolve around him, not fading to black, but to a pure white light. He felt a sensation of movement, not through space, but through state. He was being translated. He blinked. He was standing in the cold, damp subway tunnel. The rough-hewn rock wall was in front of him, solid and unyielding. The key was in his hand, cool and inert once more, its metallic surface dull in the beam of his flashlight, which lay on the ground where he had dropped it. He picked up the torch. His body felt heavy, real, grounded. The distant rumble of a train vibrated through the tunnel, a sound he had never thought he would be grateful to hear. He turned and walked back the way he had come, his steps firm and sure. When he emerged into the service yard, the gray city sky had never looked more vibrant. The hum of traffic was a symphony. The shout of a vendor was a poem. He returned to the municipal archive the next day. He did not quit his job, but he was a different man. He still sorted the papers, still filed the ledgers, but he did it with a new reverence. He was no longer just preserving the past. He was honoring it, knowing that every scrap of paper, every faded signature was a bulwark against the silent gray plains of forgetting. He knew that one day these two would fade, and that was as it should be. But for now they were here, they were real, and they mattered. The key he placed back into its small wooden box. He did not hide it. He put it on a shelf in his flat, a simple, beautiful object. He would look at it sometimes, not with obsession, but with a quiet gratitude. It had shown him the silence, and in doing so had taught him to truly hear the noise and the music of the world. He had walked through the door of what might be, and had returned with the only wisdom that truly matters, that the beauty of a thing lies not in its permanence but in its fleeting, glorious, and noisy existence. Arthur Pindle, the keeper of quiet halls, had finally found his peace in the sound of life itself. The change in Arthur was not dramatic, but it was absolute, like a stone worn smooth by a constant, gentle river. He performed his duties at the archive with the same meticulous care, but the frantic energy of completion was gone, replaced by a deep, unhurried reverence. He would sometimes spend a full hour on a single letter from a forgotten mayor, tracing the flourish of the signature with his finger, not to decipher it, but to feel the ghost of the intention behind it. He was no longer just preserving records, he was communing with echoes. He began to make small, seemingly insignificant changes. He bought a potted plant for his desk, a resilient fern that thrived in the dim light. Its vibrant green was a shock of life in the sepia-toned world. He started to greet the few researchers who came in with a genuine warmth, asking about their projects, listening to their passions. He heard the story of a woman tracing her family's history through ship manifests, and of a man studying the evolution of paving stones in the city. To Arthur, these were no longer dry academic pursuits, they were acts of defiance, small, brave fires lit against the vast, silent dark he now knew waited for everything. One afternoon, he was tasked with clearing out a closet of broken furniture and outdated office supplies. Among the debris of splintered chair legs and dried-out ink pots, he found a small, water-stained cardboard box. Inside were not documents but photographs, hundreds of them loose and curling at the edges. They were the archive's own forgotten memories, pictures of staff picnics from half a century ago, blurred images of holiday parties, a portrait of a long-dead custodian posing proudly with his new electric floor polisher. The old Arthur would have seen this as clutter. The new Arthur sat on the floor right there in the hallway, the dust motes dancing in a sunbeam from a high window, and he looked through every single one. He saw young faces he recognized as the now-aged senior archivists. He saw fashions come and go. He saw cakes being cut, hands being shaken, glasses being raised, and toasts long since silenced. These were the moments that had built the very institution he served, the lived experience that gave meaning to the dry documents he tended. They were the laughter and the camaraderie that existed between the lines of the official minutes. He did not file them away in a new, acid-free folder. Instead, he went to a local framer and bought a large, simple corkboard. He spent a week carefully selecting photographs, arranging them not chronologically but by feeling. A serious group shot next to a silly one of someone wearing a paper crown. The proud custodian next to a picture of a secretary laughing so hard she had tears in her eyes. He hung the board on the wall in the main reading room under a simple brass plaque he had engraved himself, "We who worked here." It became a point of quiet fascination. Older staff members would stand before it, pointing and smiling, telling stories to the younger ones. The researchers would glance at it and see the humanity behind the records they sought. The archive, for the first time in living memory, felt not just like a repository but like a place that had been and still was alive. At home, his life was similarly transformed. His flat was no longer just a place of quiet order. He bought a second-hand radio and would often let it play, not caring much for the programs but for the simple comfort of the human voices. He began to frequent a small cafe down the street, not for the coffee but for the noise. The clatter of cups, the snippets of conversation, the barista's cheerful greeting, it was all a glorious, chaotic symphony. He had heard the absolute silence, and now every sound was a precious jewel. He would sometimes take the key from its box. He would hold it in his palm, feeling its familiar, cool weight. It was no longer a question or a temptation, it was a reminder, a compass that had pointed him toward the most important truth. That meaning is not found in the eternal but in the temporary, that a thing's value is not diminished by its end but is, in fact, defined by it. One evening, sitting in his armchair as the city lights began to glitter outside his window, he realized the final, quiet lesson. He had spent his life fearing oblivion, both his own and that of the things he cared for. He had tried to build a fortress of paper against the tide of time. Now he knew that was a fool's errand. The beauty was not in the permanence, but in the moment. The joy of the staff picnic was no less real because the people in the photograph were old or gone. The love in a faded letter was no less potent because the writer and recipient had returned to dust. The key had shown him the shore of the great ocean of silence, and instead of making him fear the water, it had taught him to cherish the boat. His life, his work, his conversations, the taste of his coffee, the sound of the rain, these were the boat. They were temporary, fragile, and infinitely beautiful. He placed the key back in its box and closed the lid. He did not lock it. He simply set it aside, a part of his history now, a quiet teacher that had finished its work. He looked out at the humming, blinking, messy, glorious city and he smiled. Arthur Pindle was no longer just a keeper of quiet halls. He was a grateful citizen of the noisy, fleeting, wonderful world, and that was more than enough. It was everything. The memory of the silence made the sound of his own contented sigh the sweetest music he had ever heard. The great catalog was complete, and his own small, vibrant entry was being written, one lived moment at a time, until its inevitable and perfectly natural end.